Hello. In this second little gripe, which is a scripted video with really generic footage behind it, it's time to talk about weapon durability in Breath of the Wild. I say time to, but I just mean that I'm going to do it too. The fun thing about this topic is that everyone has an opinion on it. Most of those opinions seem to be binary. Either it needs to be removed entirely, or that it's an angelic delivery of modern gaming principles from baby Jesus himself. Now, I can already hear some of you opening the comment box, because you want to vomit your opinion down there as soon as possible. I can also hear some of you frantically whipping the timeline to the end so you can hear what you assume to be my bottom line. That way you can spray the thing you already have in your mouth without the burden of having to put anything into your ears. Hey, cut that out. Breath of the Wild released 53 years ago, which was 2,000 years after the release of Ocarina of Time. Thanks, baby Jesus. I waited all this time for the slim chance that people would stop talking about it, so that I could state my flimsy opinion. It's just like living with my family of loud-mouthed, mouth-breathing apes who wake up screeching whatever fake political conspiracy they read about but did no research on the night before. Or, say, trying to interact with more than 3 people on a Discord call, as they shrilly howl memes and witlessly bellow inane internet gossip about people none of them actually know. You just have to wait for your turn to speak. That way, when no one listens, you at least know that they heard you. So, keep your greasy little fingers off those keys. I see you. Let's be honest. Just like any discussion with my old racist father, trying to communicate with a Japanese game developer will only result in a glossy-eyed stare, or a sudden escalation to red-faced primate violence. The Japanese gaming industry is not known for listening to feedback. Often they're blissfully unaware of issues in their games that even the players have long since dismissed as even being meme-worthy. Such developers repeat the same mistake in 5 different games before allowing a new generation of younger developers to create a new mistake while fixing the old. And all the while, they won't even know if people are discussing the game. The only important thing to them is whether or not their insular vision is being realized, and whether it's making money. In many cases, they certainly don't care what anyone outside of their nation has to say about anything. Japan is a weird country. But I don't need to tell you that. You already know this. You're watching a Plague of Gripes brand video, and in these videos you either get the joke, or you're professionally angry at phantoms. But let's talk about weapon durability in Breath of the Wild anyway. Not because your dad will actually listen to you, just because it's fun to imagine a better future. The script was written on November 2nd. Just thought I'd mention that for no reason. In Zelda games, Zelda himself, has always had a small armory of weapons and tools. From the first game onward, Link has used a variety of swords, magic, master, or otherwise, to puncture, prod, and perforate enemy and Cuckoo alike. Alongside his sword, he's always used a variety of tools. Lanterns, bombs, rupee-fueled armor, horrid man-faced chicken things with glowing green nipples on their front and back. The best of these, of course, is the double hook shot, but I digress. Breath of the Wild took this rule and elaborated upon it by allowing the player to use a much wider variety of weapons. I say wider variety, but most of this variety is only visual. The vast majority of weapons could be divided into using either the sword animation set or the really big sword animation set. Fewer still use the polearm animations. From there, the animations are so close to being identical that it's easy to mistake them. A soup ladle technically has a unique animation, but it's still essentially a one-handed sword animation. There are numerous ways to nitpick this assertion, but you get what I mean. Weapons are their functions, and these functions aren't drastically different in Breath of the Wild. A wind cleaver certainly swings differently than a sledgehammer, but the most radical difference between the two is visual. This isn't Dark Souls 3 or anything. Again, you can easily disagree that the weapons are not radically distinct, but understand my point. There's no need to get overly attached to a very specific weapon because they're more or less the same as any other weapon either in their class or peripheral to its class. This is by design, of course. It saved time in development, of course, but also ensured that players wouldn't need to worry about preserving a single distinct weapon. Once that wind cleaver broke, if they wanted a heavy weapon, they could still find one pretty much anywhere. In Breath of the Wild, every weapon, shield, or bow has its own durability. As you use it, it loses durability until it breaks. It cannot be repaired. It shatters and is deleted from the game forever. Whether it's a rusted sword or a unique weapon given to you as a story reward for clearing a major dungeon, if you use it at all, it will be destroyed. There are some exceptions to this. The Master Sword is a weapon of the game and will lose durability. However, once it is destroyed, it will instead enter a recharging phase and become available again a few minutes later. Also, there is something of an exploit allowing players to throw weapons into rock Octorok enemies, who will inhale and spit them back out with max durability, effectively allowing you to repair them. The effective durability is quite a range. A tree branch will shatter in about one combo. A Hylian shield will survive hours of use before breaking. Bows are somewhere in the middle. It's important to note how long it takes to break an item because that determines two things. How often you will be engaged with the durability system, and how often you will be engaged with managing the inventory. Inventory in Breath of the Wild is not limitless. As you use melee weapons the most, and they break the easiest, I'll be concentrating on them as my example. You begin with 8 empty slots. You can fill these slots with 8 gigantic dragon bone weapons, or 8 tree branches. It isn't weight or quality based, it's just slot based. As such, after you pick up your 8th weapon, you'll find that you are allowed to pick up a 9th. If you want the 9th weapon, you must either throw the weapon in your hand or enter the inventory and choose a weapon to drop. There are also a small handful of weapons that have some minor form of utility. Torches can be lit and carried to obliterate the darkness. Korok leaves have a middling use in powering boats or pelting your enemies with a refreshing breeze. Certain other weapons have elemental properties, allowing them to electrify enemies, freeze them, and so on. And you may also carry around an axe to cut down trees, although honestly, just throwing bombs at them does the job that much faster. Point being, there are a lot of considerations to have in choosing what will go into your limited inventory. Again, this is by design. I mentioned this in my first little gripe about Baldur's Gate 3, that the weapon durability system in this game definitely sucked ass. While I was being hyperbolic because I fancy myself a cutie pie, I will still assert this durability system does, in fact, suck ass. I would contend that most players don't particularly care for inventories most of the time. Weight systems that force you to constantly manage and drop off items are often one of the first things modded out of most games. The same can be said for crafting systems. And naturally, the same is true for simple slot-based inventory management like you find in Breath of the Wild. Personally, I kind of like limited inventories, but only when it's handled well. I have never seen it handled well. In the fantasy I have of a limited inventory in a game that doesn't make it annoying, I imagine equipping a favored gun, or sword, or magic dog, and then, empty-handed otherwise, going out into the wild to do some killing. More importantly, to do some looting. In this fantasy, almost everything I pick up is stackable and holds almost no weight at all. After all, in video game logic, you're carrying an invisible cart behind you at all times in the form of cartoon hammer space, because who wants to pathfind a mule-drawn carriage? I toss my big piles of money, resources, and love letters into this imaginary cart. It isn't until I encounter a weapon or set of armor that weight even really begins to truly factor in. You see, in the headspace of my fantasy cart simulation, there is a foundational rule controlling what I perceive as fun. The restriction on my carrying capacity is only addressed by items I place value in. In other words, the less value a player places on an item, the less space it should occupy. In my fantasy, I then return after finding my glowing new magic wolf or gun fueled by the souls of orphans, whatever it is. I place it in my war chest, which has no weight or object limits. I then mentally note what other items I might need to create a new build, a new method of venturing out into the world to do more killing, more looting. After making this mental note, I return back to the wilds to make another run. Personally, this falls in line with my preferred method of gearing up to fight in gaming as opposed to my hated method of fighting to gear up. I enjoy preparing to delve into a dungeon before finding one or two major objectives, which I must then fight to return to my home with, in tow on my invisible super mule cart. Of course, games don't often do this. More often, too much random shit on the ground is somewhat valuable, but also heavy. More importantly, it isn't useful beyond just being a consumable resource or something to be turned into currency. The player places no value in it beyond its ability to be transformed into a value for hex number 000F. Or instead of finding one all-important gun, you will find 100 shitty little guns. You don't like or value any of them, but you found them and you can probably sell or break them down, so you have to waste your time gathering them. There are numerous factors at play in the player psychology of these moments. When designing your game, you have to decide whether it needs things like limited inventory. Does it need weapon durability? Does it need lots of superfluous vendor items? What effect does this have on the sense of fun the player is having? To what intensity should these choices be employed? Perhaps right now you're thinking of your own preferences, and what level of intensity you would desire. Most gamers don't understand restrictions. Why not have a limitless inventory? Why not have no weapon durability? Designers can't afford to want first and design second. Much like the owner of a new puppy, you can't afford to give it whatever it wants all the time. You have to set limits, and parent it the same way you would a child. Otherwise, its relationship with the world falls apart. In Breath of the Wild, careful consideration was given to the limits imposed on the player to ensure that the world did not fall apart. The reason why I then comically describe the durability system as definitely sucking ass is primarily because of its incomplete realization of its fatherly goals towards us, the puppy. Breath of the Wild could have done a lot of things. It could have given you the Master Sword in the tutorial, and had that be the only weapon in the whole game. It would not have been a good idea, but they could have done that. They also could have had 50 different weapons in the game, given them all infinite durability, but only had one of each, hidden in secret locations. It would not have been a good idea. They could have done that. They could have kept the entire system the way it is now, but had no inventory restrictions at all, so instead of 8 tree branches you could carry every tree branch in Hyrule. That would not have been a good idea. They didn't do that one. The goal of its designers was for Breath of the Wild to give the experience of a lone traveler surviving in the wilderness, without the intensity of a survival game. To that end, having to manage resources such as your weapons was a good idea. Restricting carrying capacity in some way, and also ensuring the player has to rotate through weapons, was also a good idea. Many players, the dullards that live amongst the rest of us, will use the first thing they pick up. Many Dark Souls players use the starting weapon, or the first cool one they ever found, or the one that they were told to use by someone online. Despite picking up dozens of other weapons, they will never equip any of them, because they're satisfied with bludgeoning their way through life without any thought or consideration. I have absolute faith that such players would immediately race for the Master Sword, equip it, and then never remove it if given that option. So yes, even the Master Sword requiring some form of downtime was a good idea. In theory. This system does not work at 100% capacity because of some basic oversights to the human interaction required for these systems. Let's go over a few of those oversights, shall we? Example number one. Many players will spend inordinate amounts of time safely bombing enemies to death from afar in order to conserve their resources. Having bombs deal almost no damage does nothing to dissuade this behavior because the core issue is that players don't want to have to interact with the durability system any more than is needed. Example 2. The Master Sword, once obtained, is the only weapon in your inventory that is guaranteed to not be destroyed. As such, it is often relegated to being used for things you wouldn't want to use your other weapons on. Examples include harvesting gems from rocks, cutting down trees, or cryosis slapping big meaty boulders. And because weapon durability does not recharge the Master Sword when it is not active, players will slap it against rock facings for no reason other than they want to break it, so that it will begin recharging again. This relegates the legendary Master Sword to being a rechargeable electric branch cutter. Third example. Despite weapons being incredibly common, many players will max out their inventories and then spend a lot of time weeding them with slightly stronger variants that they still refuse to use. In other words, players can spend more time managing the system than using it. This is due mostly to the durability values of weapons being intensely low, while the quality of most drop weapons also being intensely bad. To put it a third way, the weapons that players place value on have almost no actual value because all weapons are pretty shitty. Itty bitty pretty shitty. To parse this a fourth way, players want to enjoy using a cool looking sword, and it's hard to do that when you know it'll explode in 10 swings. Notice a common trend with these sorts of problems. They aren't system issues so much as player interface issues. They would all be fine if the game was being played by a robot. Some of you may be complaining, I never did that, I didn't have that problem. It doesn't matter if you did or didn't. Many players do, and when designing a game you have to try to factor in the player psychology behind as many players as you can. As I said, I actually like the general direction of the weapon durability system. Its main issue is that, much like Japanese game developers, it's sort of a passive asshole that won't listen to anyone but itself, and isn't considerate of its users. I listed 3 examples, but there's one core issue. The system is at play too often, at least in regards with weapons. Notice this is not really as much of an issue with bows or shields. It isn't necessarily because bows and shields aren't used as much. I think it actually has a Bloodborne problem on its hands. In Bloodborne, which was a departure from Dark Souls, the game had a very limited selection of weapons because of their nature. As a result, when fighting enemies, they dropped almost nothing. Enemies in Souls games, for example, would drop armor pieces, weapons, and various items. In Bloodborne, weapons were unique, clothing was unique, and having too abundant of a supply of certain items could greatly harm the experience. As a result, the vast majority of drops were blood vials. It seems, and this is an assumption of mine, I can say this is a fact, that the healing system was used in concert with a farmable resource for heals in order to supplement the experience of killing enemies and finding rewards on their bodies. Breath of the Wild has a similar issue to this. In my imaginary cart scenario from before, note that I placed almost no value on most items, only on things I personally found great value in. It's difficult to keep players engaged with enemy drops unless it's something the player greatly desires. I believe this is why weapons in Breath of the Wild specifically have such shitty durability values. The more often they break, the more often you'll need more of them. And the more often you need more of them, the more you'll be glad to see them drop as a resource. If every enemy drops a weapon, the player has that many options, and you can degrade weapons that much faster. You can see the logic they employed for this system, but as stated, it comes up way too often. It becomes very tiring having to constantly switch weapons, throw weapons, drop weapons, enter your inventory, evaluate the weapons and recall their individual damage values, and pick up and drop weapons to determine their individual worth. This happens constantly. And enemy drops can't be of consistent quality either. Some of your drops are so bad that you could have found them a few minutes into the game, while others are such tremendous overkill that using them at all against most enemies would just be wasteful. Making the player engage with the system and evaluate their needs is a good thing for this kind of game, it just happens 10 times more often than it should. So, time to workshop solutions! Yay! The good news is that there are many potential solutions. I know they don't just come down to removing the system entirely. The goal of adjusting the system should be twofold. To first, reduce the amount of pester activity involved in forcing the player to evaluate items without reducing the engagement of fighting and looting enemies. And second, allowing players to actually find and retain value in their preferences without allowing them to become permanent fixtures. Alongside the second goal is the sub-goal of allowing unique skins of weapons to not be wasted. Like Mifa's trident should never be destroyed, even if you can go through a lengthy quest to build another version of it. It's a ridiculous problem. The most immediately obvious means of rectifying the system while meeting our two goals, to me, would probably be a repair system of some kind. Many games allow the breaking down of surplus items to repair more valuable ones. The Fallout games are an example of this, as well as something like Outer Worlds by extension. However, in such a system for Breath of the Wild, weapons would need to hit 0 durability and not be destroyed. Otherwise, a constant paranoia of losing weapons would take hold. This would also create a problem of organizing junk weapons apart from your real weapons. It also does not coexist with the goal of ensuring players are using different weapons for different purposes throughout a single fight. It would also create another step in inventory management by forcing players to go through all their weapons, breaking them down, and repairing them. So, while such a system adjustment is an obvious one, I reject it as an alternative. I don't think that it would actually coexist within the system's goals, as that form. Another way of looking at the system is to think of its rhythm. Link spots some dudes, run in the wrong colors, and decides to roll on some fools. We want Link, the player, to engage the enemy and then organically switch from one weapon to another, and perhaps do so a second or third time. We can't rely on the player making this choice on their own, as we've covered that many players are little more than unthinking ape creatures. As such, the weapons must break, forcing a switch. Upon the end of the battle, we also want a pile of loot for the player to parse. Not all loot should be useful to the player, otherwise they would mindlessly mash through everything and find no value in it. We also want to avoid constant inventory management. This should be something that happens naturally and not involve the use of any menus. We also wish for the player to be able to retain specific weapons of their choosing, so that they cannot be lost even if they break. The time frame of recovery should also not be so great that it forces the player to wait around and re-enter the menu screen to hasten their ability to get into another bloody American History X style street fight. While any system I or others can propose will have failings, I then propose this slightly altered version of the first example. In this version, Link is given a loot inventory as well as an equip inventory. Instead of 8 generic slots by default that can be expanded to a maximum of 19 plus 1 for the Master Sword, there is now a slot for one-handed, two-handed, offhand, and utility. All one-handed weapons can go into the one-handed slot, all two-handed into the two-handed slot, and weapons such as boomerangs or magic rods go into the offhand slot. The utility slot is reserved for non-weapons the player possesses like Korok leaves, torches, mining tools, or wood axes. The player begins the game with 2 open slots for each category, totaling 8 total slots. When adding new slots, the player can choose to increase any of the weapon categories up to a maximum of 4 or 5 of one category. Perhaps as a courtesy, the utility slots are free in some way and not considered, something like that. Most importantly, weapons placed into these equipment slots do not permanently break. Rather, during the fight, they will lose their durability and become unavailable, forcing the player into the next weapon in that slot. If all weapons have been exhausted, only then would the player need to enter the menu and replace some of them. Alternatively, weapons in the field can be picked up and used as an unslotted weapon without worrying about doing this at all. Same as normal. The specified slots exist in this example to ensure that the players have a lot to choose from, but it is still a variety of weapons. I imagine the UI choosing weapons would still look mostly the same, but just have some bracket lines to indicate the category. So far, our system is mostly the same. Now for the most important part. There is a distinction between picking up a weapon and looting a weapon. In the field, rather than picking up the weapon and putting it in your inventory, you may instead perform a longer animation by holding the command or tapping it, whichever you prefer, that will instead break down the weapon and grant your equipped weapons its durability back. For example, Link has just finished curb stomping a moblin family, as he is wont to do. The act weighs upon his mind only a moment, as his heart has become hardened by years of intense violence. His royal broadsword was broken in the fight. On the field, he spots 3 dropped weapons: a traveler's spear, a rusty broadsword, and a thunderblade. The first is a spear, and he has no spears equipped. This goes into his loot inventory. He can't use it for this. The second is a low-quality, one-handed weapon. Without entering his menu, he holds the loot button down to break down this weapon, which restores the durability of his royal broadsword. It will not become available again until its durability hits 100%, but this increases it back to, say, 25% durability. The Thunderblade is a one-handed weapon as well, but Link decides he'd like to use it later. If he broke that Thunderblade down, it could restore his royal broadsword back to its full durability, but instead he chooses to simply place that Thunderblade back into his inventory. There is no need to enter his inventory, as all of this happens on the field. So in this example, there is still a loot inventory with a maximum limit. This, as a result, still needs to be managed sometimes, but not often based on the frequency of drops. The game should also look at the rate of use of different weapon types and adjust the spawn rate of those weapons accordingly. Weapons in the loot inventory, which could be below the screen fold of the equip screen, can be discarded and equipped as normal. You may also select an equipped weapon and choose Repair, which will highlight everything in your inventory that is compatible, allowing you to one-click destroy those weapons to repair the one you have selected. Weapons whose durability are not fully used up in this way are left with the remainder. There may also be an alert for weapons that are a higher quality than the thing you're trying to repair, and a more generic Repair All function that prioritizes low-quality weapons and will resolve all of this automatically with no real input. So in this example, the system is mostly the same as it is now, and accomplishes the same goals. Players still have to engage with the system and rotate between weapons, they still evaluate the weapons that were dropped, and still have a reason to look out for things that they'd like to keep. But now there's a way to retain weapons without totally invalidating inferior ones. More importantly, while the system is at play, it isn't constantly bashing you over the head with menus and insisting you manage it after every fight. The menus in theory shouldn't even be involved most of the time, since you're repairing most of these things out in the field. Yet you still have to engage with the menus sometimes and prioritize the use of weapons you may not use otherwise in order to use up your resources. The only thing that really changed was the addition of a protected slot that uses up something that was already disposable. By preventing broken weapon use until they are repaired to full, this also still encourages the use of non-favorite weapons and allows for their consistent routine of breaking and then repairing. As you might expect, the Master Sword would function the same as it does now, except also recharging over time instead of upon breaking, just at a slower rate than ordinary weapons you're repairing with loot. The menus in this example would remain mostly the same, except with the addition of 1 or 2 new commands. If you're wondering, utility items like torches and leaves and axes would require far less to repair or accept a more generic type of drop, but show up as weapons less frequently. Shields and bows would function basically the same, but just be repairable while having about 5 protected slots. I didn't cover everything in that example because I don't have the time, but I'm sure there's plenty to nitpick and to whine about. But you get the idea. There's a path to logic in designing a system like this. You just need to follow it and try to make something that's usable without being annoying, but still generates positive feelings for the player. My biggest concern with the example is whether it'd be annoying having to constantly hold down a button after every fight over every drop, that and whether you might accidentally destroy a weapon you had been looking for. I think the whole idea would work better if the game admitted that tree branches and bokoblin clubs weren't good options and just treated them like automatic health pickups for your weapons. A lot of this comes down to how much durability you're recovering, how often weapons actually drop, and how annoying the interface of repairing the weapons actually is. It can't be too automatic, or it just becomes a normal action game that seems to stop working sometimes because you're not actually noticing how it works. You would want it to turn into Vagrant Story, where you're breaking down weapon components and reassembling them at workbenches, even though Vagrant Story does rule. Maybe the easiest way to do this is to have a thicc companion character that floats over your shoulder and magically converts drops for you. Instead of that fucking horse whistle, when you want to repair your weapon, you press down and your giant-assed imp friend siphons in common drops, and that repairs everything in your inventory, but it prioritizes things that are more similar to your stuff. So you pull in a big pile of clubs, spears, and shit. And since most of them were spears, your spear gets repaired the fastest. And your big-bootied friend doesn't destroy anything that's as good or better than what you're using already. She attack, but she also a snack. Yeah, that's okay, let's roll with that. Of course, since this is a Japanese game, there's a 0% chance of them ever hearing anyone's opinion on the matter, unless they're part of the lead design staff. So even if we solve the problem here today, it'll probably be fucking up every Zelda game for the next 10 years. Playing Breath of the Wild makes me appreciate the open world, but also makes me want a more traditional Zelda game again. At least all the characters are hot. Damn, look at that ass. Enjoy the rest of this shitty year, everyone. Get out.